Welcome back to Polly Night. If you're looking for something to keep you company while you unwind, while the night stretches on a little longer than usual, you're in the right place. Get comfortable and let's drift into a story together. Tonight, we're turning our eyes north, far beyond the wall, to a figure whispered about in fear, myth and prophecy, a presence that loomed over Game of Thrones from its very first moments, yet was never fully understood. The Night King. We've seen the battles, the armies of the dead, the blue eyes staring out from the darkness. But long after the final episode aired, there's something about his story that still lingers. Something unresolved, something tragic. I found myself thinking less about how he was defeated and more about what he was, who he might have been, and whether he was truly the villain we believed him to be. Before we go any further, a small request. If you enjoy these late-night journeys through dark and forgotten stories, consider leaving a like or subscribing. It's a quiet way of telling me you're out there, listening, and that we should keep walking these shadowed paths together. Because to understand the Night King, we have to go back, before the wall, before the wars, before the dead learned how to walk, to the moment a man became a legend. Stand at Castle Black on a winter morning. Look up at that ribbon of ice, 700 feet tall, stretching from horizon to horizon. The wall. We've been told it's mankind's greatest defense. The Meister's right that it stands to keep the monsters out, to keep the wildlings at bay, to hold back the giants, to bar the door against the army of the dead. But there is another story, a story the citadel burned, a story whispered in the oldest parts of Winterfell's crypts, carved in runes on stones that predate the Andal invasion, hidden in songs that the free folk sing beyond the wall when they think no one is listening. This story suggests something that would shake the foundations of everything we believe about the North, about the Night's Watch, about the very purpose of that massive barrier of ancient ice. The wall wasn't built to keep things out. It was built to keep something in. Go back 8,000 years. Close your eyes and imagine a world we can barely comprehend now. The long night has ended. The others have been driven back into the uttermost north. The children of the forest and the first men have made their peace, sealed in blood and magic. And the wall, the great wall, stands newly built, a monument to mankind's survival. The wall was different then. It didn't look like the worn, crumbling barrier we know today, with its gaps and weak points, manned by criminals and broken men. 8,000 years ago, the wall gleamed. It hummed. You could feel it from miles away, that deep vibration in your bones, like standing next to a great bell that had just been struck. Magic moved through the ice like blood through a vein, woven into every frozen block by Brandon the Builder himself, with the aid of the children of the forest and their ancient songs. The wall was alive in a way it isn't now. It had purpose. It had awareness. Some of the oldest texts, fragments really, preserved in the Citadel's forbidden archives, suggest that the wall could think after a fashion, that it could recognize bloodlines, that it knew who should pass and who should be turned away. Castle Black was the crown jewel of the Watcher's domain, though in those days it wasn't called that. It had another name, lost to time like so many things. It was a fortress of honor, of purpose. Where today you see weathered stone and rotting timber, 8,000 years ago, you would have seen proud towers stretching toward the heavens, built from the finest materials that the north could provide. The training yards rang from dawn to dusk with the clash of steel on steel. Not the desperate, exhausted training of men preparing to die, but the proud practice of warriors who believed in their cause. The kennels housed dozens of hounds bred specifically for tracking in the deepest snows. The rookery held ravens trained to fly in weather that would ground any bird today. Every corner of Castle Black spoke of purpose, of a brotherhood united in sacred duty. Because in those days, serving the Night's Watch wasn't a punishment. It wasn't where you sent your bastards and your broken men. It was an honor. Noble houses competed to send their sons to the wall. Kings sent their younger brothers. The Night's Watch numbered in the thousands. Some accounts say 10,000 strong, and every man among them had chosen to be there. The vows meant something then. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. These weren't empty words mumbled by thieves and rapers hoping to avoid execution. These were oaths spoken with hands on ancient swords, sworn before heart trees older than memory, meant to be kept until death and perhaps beyond. At the head of this grand institution sat the 13th Lord Commander. We don't know his name. That's the first mystery. The first indication that something about this story goes deeper than a simple cautionary tale. His name was erased so thoroughly that 8,000 years later, even the best scholars can't agree on what it was. What we know for certain is that he was a Stark. He carried the blood of winter in his veins, the ancient heritage of the kings of winter who had ruled the north since the Dawn Age. Old Nan insists he was named Brandon, that cursed name, that blessed name, the name of the builder himself. Some versions of the tale say he was the brother of the King of Winter. Others claim he was a bastard son, legitimized and honored. Still others suggest he was the heir, who gave up his birthright to serve a higher purpose. He had the Stark look, tall and lean, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders and grey eyes that seemed to see through stone and shadow both. His face bore the weathered look of a man who had spent years riding the frozen wilderness, but his eyes still held warmth, still reflected the humanity that would later drain away like water through cracked ice. His hands were calloused from sword work and hard living, but those who served under him remembered that he was gentle when he tended to wounded men. He knew the name of every brother under his command. He remembered the farms and families they had left behind. He understood the sacrifices each had made to take the Black. When new recruits arrived, frightened boys and uncertain men, it was often the Lord Commander himself who would speak with them, helping them understand that their new life, though harsh, held meaning and honor. The other brothers revered him. He had proven his courage in a dozen battles against wildling raiders. He had ventured farther north than any Lord Commander before him, mapping territories that had been unknown since the Long Night. He was a scholar as well as a warrior, spending long hours in Castle Black's library, studying the ancient texts, trying to understand the true history of the Watch and the Wall. His solar overlooked the wall and the lands beyond, its windows offering a view that stretched to the horizon on clear days. Maps covered every available surface, marked with patrol routes, wildling camp locations, and the ever-changing positions of the ranging parties that ventured beyond the wall. He studied these maps with the dedication of a master playing a game of Sivas, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always seeking to protect his men while fulfilling their sacred duty. He had 3 trusted companions who shared his daily burden of command. Sir Roderick Dustin, called the Grey Wolf for his silver beard and fierce loyalty, served as the Lord Commander's first ranger. He was a man of the old ways, who still made offerings to the heart trees and could read weather patterns like ancient runes. His knowledge of the lands beyond the wall was unmatched, and his bow could bring down an elk at distances that seemed impossible. Roderick was perhaps 50 years old, an ancient age for a ranger, but his eyes were still sharp and his hands still steady. Meister Qyburn, no relation to the later Qyburn of dark reputation, maintained the castle's ravens and its library. Unlike the Meisters who would later serve the watch, Qyburn possessed an unusual interest in the more esoteric texts, the books that dealt with magic and ancient lore. His chain bore links of Valyrian steel, marking him as one of the few maesters who had studied the higher mysteries. He had taken his vows late in life at 40, after a career as a scholar in Old Town that had raised eyebrows among the archmeisters. Sir Jeremy Risewell, the Lord Steward, was a practical man who ensured that Castle Black ran smoothly. He had once been heir to a minor lordship in the north, but had taken the Black after a scandal involving a wildling woman and a duel that left 2 men dead. His understanding of logistics and his ability to manage men made him invaluable to the Lord Commander's daily operations. These 3 men noticed the changes in their leader before anyone else. It began with reports, small things at first. Wildling settlements found empty, not massacred. That would have been understandable, terrible, but comprehensible. No, these settlements were simply abandoned. Their people vanished without a trace. Ranger Kryken, a grizzled veteran of 20 years' service, brought the first report. He stumbled through the gates of Castle Black at dawn, his horse foam-flecked and trembling, his own eyes wide with something that went beyond mere fear. An entire village of free folk, maybe 300 souls, simply gone. Not dead, not fled, absent. Their homes stood untouched, fires still smouldering in hearths, meals half-eaten on wooden tables. Children's toys lay scattered in the mud as if dropped mid-play, but no bodies, no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away from the settlement. The Lord Commander studied the rough map Kryken had sketched, noting the location some 40 leagues beyond the wall, near a grove of ancient weirwoods that the wildlings considered sacred. His fingers traced the parchment, while his mind wrestled with explanations that made sense. Raiders took captives but left evidence. Sickness killed but left corpses. Natural disasters scattered people but destroyed their homes. This was something else entirely. What disturbed him most was Kryken's description of the silence. Not the quiet of an abandoned place, but a deeper absence of sound, as if the very forest held its breath. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no whisper of wind through the branches. Even the stream that ran through the village centre flowed without its usual babbling voice. More reports followed over the coming weeks, each one stranger than the last. Hunters who never returned from routine expeditions, wildling bands that simply disappeared between one relay point and another, and always that same eerie silence in the places they had last been seen. Then came the sightings of lights in the northern sky, not the familiar aurora that danced green and blue across the winter nights. The Northmen knew those lights well, had grown up watching them, had songs about them. These were different, steady points of cold blue radiance that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. A merchant's caravan reported seeing these lights move against the natural flow of the aurora, following them along the King's Road like watching eyes. The Lord Commander began to have trouble sleeping. The dreams started subtly, a whisper on the edge of waking, a sensation of being watched from a great distance. The Lord Commander would wake in his chambers with his heart pounding, unable to remember what he dreamed, knowing only that something had called to him in the darkness. Then the dreams became clearer. He saw her standing alone in a landscape of eternal winter. The sky above her was the deep black of a moonless night, but she seemed to generate her own light, a pale blue radiance that illuminated the snow around her. She stood utterly still, yet he had the impression of immense power barely contained, like watching the surface of a frozen lake and knowing that beneath the ice, currents of unimaginable force were flowing. Her face was the most beautiful and terrible thing he had ever seen. Beautiful because it was perfect, every line and angle precisely balanced, symmetrical in a way that human faces never quite achieved. Terrible because it was too perfect, too cold, as if a master sculptor had carved her from the purest white marble and forgotten to add the spark of life. Her skin was white as fresh fallen snow, luminous in the darkness. Her hair fell like spun silver down her back, and when the wind touched it, though there seemed to be no wind in that frozen place, the very air around her shimmered with dancing motes of ice. But her eyes were what haunted him. Blue, but not the blue of summer skies or northern seas. They were the deep blue of ancient ice, of glaciers that had never known sunlight, of winter that stretched beyond the memory of man. When she looked at him, and in his dreams, she always looked directly at him. He felt as though she could see through flesh and bone to the very essence of his soul. She never spoke with a voice he could hear, but he understood her nonetheless. Her words came on winds that shouldn't exist, speaking in a language that predated human speech, yet somehow he knew what she was saying. Come to me. Come and see what lies beyond your wall. Come and learn the truths your meisters have forgotten. Every night, the dream grew stronger. Every morning, the Lord Commander would wake to find frost coating his chamber windows, despite the roaring fire in his hearth. His breath would mist in the air of his solar, even in the height of summer. His men began to whisper that something fundamental was changing in their leader, and they were right. The decision came to him not in a moment of sudden revelation, but like the slow dawn that crept across the northern mountains, inevitable and transforming. The Lord Commander woke on a morning when the autumn air carried the first true bite of approaching winter, and he knew with absolute certainty that he could no longer remain safely behind the wall while such mysteries beckoned from the lands beyond. His vows bound him to be the watcher on the walls, the shield that guards the realms of men. But how could he protect what he did not understand? How could he defend against threats he had never faced? Sir Roderick found him in the armory before dawn, methodically checking the edge of his ancestral sword, a blade of castle-forged steel that had served Stark men for 3 centuries. The old ranger needed no explanation. He'd seen this restlessness building in his commander for weeks. "How many men?" Roderick asked simply. "6, the Lord Commander replied without hesitation. "Ourselves, Sir Jeremy for his steady sword, young Thomas Umber for his tracking skills, Micken the Forester because he knows the old wildling paths, and Sir Alistair Thorne for his experience with strange occurrences. Each man chosen represented a different skill, a different strength that might prove necessary in the unknown lands ahead. But more than that, each was someone the Lord Commander trusted absolutely. Men who had proven their loyalty and courage in the harsh crucible of service on the wall. The preparations took 3 days. Supplies were gathered with careful attention to traveling light, while carrying enough provisions for an extended journey. Extra cloaks, rope, climbing gear, weapons, both steel and obsidian, for the old texts spoke of creatures vulnerable to dragon glass, medical supplies, and most importantly, detailed maps of the territories beyond the wall. Meister Qyburn provided items from his private collection that were not standard ranging equipment, vials of lamp oil that burned with unusual brightness, ground silver for wounds that might not heal naturally, and a small pouch of salt from the summer sea that the oldest texts claimed had power against creatures of ice and shadow. On the morning of departure, the Lord Commander stood one final time in his solar, looking out over the wall and the realm it protected. Castle Black bustled with its normal activity below. Brothers going about their duties, unaware that their leader was about to cross a threshold from which he might never return unchanged. The small party gathered at the tunnel's northern entrance as the sun crested the horizon. Each man carried his own thoughts about the journey ahead, his own fears and anticipations, but all shared an unspoken understanding that they rode towards something that would change them forever. The tunnel through the wall stretched before them like a throat of ice. Its ancient magic thrummed almost audibly in the frozen walls. As they passed beneath 700 feet of warded ice, the Lord Commander felt the protective enchantments of his ancestors washing over him, blessing and warning him in equal measure. The magic recognized his Stark blood, welcomed him, but also whispered cautions about the powers that dwelt in the lands ahead. When they emerged on the northern side, the difference was immediately apparent. The air itself felt different, thinner somehow, charged with possibilities that did not exist south of the wall. The very light seemed cleaner, more pure, as if they had stepped into a world where the ordinary rules of nature held less sway. Their horses, carefully chosen for stamina and sure footing, sensed the change as well. Ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring, they moved with the heightened alertness of animals entering territory that belonged to predators they could smell but not see. The first day's ride took them through familiar territory, lands that ranging parties had mapped and explored countless times over the decades. But even these well-known paths seemed subtly altered, as if the landscape itself was responding to some fundamental shift in the balance of power. Streams ran differently, following new channels that had not existed in previous seasons. Trees stood in groves that rangers swore had been empty meadows only months before. The very stones seemed to be watching their passage, ancient cairns catching the light in ways that made them look almost alive. By afternoon, they had reached the edge of the truly wild lands, where even the boldest wildling clans rarely ventured. Here the trees grew differently, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. The path, such as it was, became little more than game trails winding between massive trunks that had stood since before the conquest of Westeros. It was in this twilight realm that they found the first clear signs of her presence. Footprints in patches of earth that should have been too hard to take impressions. Each print perfectly formed and impossibly delicate. Not the marks of boots or shoes, but bare feet that seemed to float across the ground rather than press into it. The prints were small, feminine, but they appeared alongside the tracks of creatures that no living man had catalogued. Mikan the forester, who could track a sparrow across bare stone, knelt beside one particularly clear set of marks. "She walks with companions," he reported quietly. "Things that move on 4 legs sometimes, 2 legs at others, but always in perfect silence. And my lord, these tracks were made within the hour. She knows we're coming." That night they made camp in a grove of ancient oaks, whose massive trunks provided some shelter from the wind. The fire burned clean and bright, but its warmth seemed to extend only a few feet before being swallowed by a cold that had nothing to do with the season. As the others slept, the Lord Commander stood watch, his hand never straying far from his sword hilt. The darkness beyond their small circle of firelight was absolute, but he could sense movement within it, shapes that shifted and flowed like living shadows, not threatening exactly, but evaluating, measuring, deciding what manner of men had come calling in the deep places of the world. And through it all, he could feel her presence drawing closer, a magnetic pull that seemed to emanate from his very bones. Tomorrow, he knew, they would find her. Tomorrow, the mysterious woman who had haunted his dreams would step from legend into reality. Tomorrow, everything would change. Dawn came slowly to the haunted forest, filtered through branches that seemed to absorb light rather than allow it to pass. The Lord Commander woke to find frost covering everything in their camp, despite the fire that had burned throughout the night. But this was not ordinary frost. Each crystal formation was perfect, geometric, almost deliberate in its beauty. When Thomas Umber reached to brush it from his cloak, the ice did not melt at his touch, but simply faded away like morning mist. They reached the abandoned wildling village by midday. It lay before them exactly as Crichton had described, but somehow more unsettling in the daylight. 300 people could not simply vanish without explanation. Yet here was proof that they had done exactly that. The home stood intact, their hide walls and wooden frames showing no signs of violence or decay. Personal belongings lay scattered about as if dropped in the middle of daily activities. A child's carved toy horse sat beside a fire pit where coals still glowed with unnatural warmth. Bowls of some kind of stew remained on tables, still warm to the touch, despite having been abandoned for weeks. But it was the silence that proved most unnerving. No insects buzzed in the still air. No birds called from the surrounding trees. Even their own voices seemed muffled, as if the very atmosphere absorbed sound before it could travel far. The absence of life was so complete, it felt like a physical presence, a weight pressing down upon them from the empty sky. Thomas Umber found the first body, or what remained of one, hidden beneath a collapsed section of roof in the village's central lodge. But death had touched this wildling in no way that any of them had encountered before. The corpse showed no signs of disease, violence, or decay. Instead, it appeared to have been perfectly preserved, frozen in ice so clear it was nearly invisible. The man's face was peaceful, almost serene, but his eyes had changed from whatever color they had been in life to a deep, startling blue. The same blue that haunted the Lord Commander's dreams. More bodies were discovered as they searched the village systematically. All showed the same characteristics: perfect preservation, peaceful expressions, and eyes that blazed with cold blue fire even in death. Whatever had claimed the free folk had not been violent or sudden. It had been almost gentle, like falling into the deepest, most restful sleep imaginable. In the village's sacred grove, where weirwood trees older than human memory stretched their bone-white branches toward the sky, they found evidence of something more deliberate. The earth had been cleared and swept clean, forming a perfect circle beneath the heart tree's ancient gaze. Strange symbols were carved into the ground, not burned or etched, but somehow pressed into the very soil, as if by enormous pressure applied from above. At the circle's center lay a pool of water that reflected not the sky above, but depths that seemed to extend far below the earth's surface. When Mikan dropped a stone into the pool to test its depth, they heard no splash, no sound of the stone striking bottom. The water remained perfectly still, its surface like polished obsidian. And it was here, in this sacred space where the old gods had watched over generations of free folk, that she finally appeared to them. The Lord Commander sensed her presence before he saw her. A change in the air that made his skin prickle with recognition. When he turned, she stood at the grove's edge, no longer the distant figure from dreams and rumors, but a living woman stepping from between the ancient trees. Her beauty was beyond anything mortal flesh could achieve, yet it was beauty touched by something utterly alien. Her skin held the luminous quality of fresh snow under starlight, and her hair moved in a breeze that touched nothing else in the grove. But her eyes held intelligence, awareness, and something that might have been loneliness stretching across centuries of solitude. When she spoke, her voice carried the music of wind through ice caverns, of glaciers shifting in the deep places of the world. You have come at last. I have been waiting for you since the stars were young, since the first men learned to kindle fire against the darkness. You carry the blood of kings, the heritage of those who made bargains with powers beyond mortal understanding. Will you hear what I offer, child of winter's line? The Lord Commander felt his companions tense behind him, hands moving instinctively toward weapons that would prove useless against what stood before them. But he found himself stepping forward, drawn by forces he could not name or resist, moving toward a choice that would echo through 8,000 years of history. She called herself many things across the millennia. Nissa in some ages, the Ice Queen in others, the Mother of Winter in still older tales. Whether any of these were her true name, she did not say. What mattered was what she represented, the last remnant of the children of the forest's greatest and most terrible creation. I was not always as you see me now, she said, her blue eyes reflecting depths that seemed to hold the memory of every winter that had ever touched the world. Once I walked in sunlight and knew the warmth of mortal flesh, but the children, in their desperation and their wisdom, chose me for a purpose greater than any single life. She told them the truth about the others, and it was not the story that had been passed down through the ages. The truth was more complex, more tragic, and far more dangerous than simple tales of monsters and heroes. The children of the forest had not created the others as weapons of genocide. They had created them as guardians, beings who could survive where even the children could not go, who could preserve the sacred places and ancient knowledge when everything else crumbled to dust. Ice, she explained, does not decay. Ice preserves. Ice holds things in perfect stasis, unchanged by time or corruption. The long night had not been an invasion. It had been a failure of communication, a tragic misunderstanding between beings who could not comprehend each other's purposes. The others had been created to be bridges between the warm world of growing things and the cold realm of eternal preservation. But over time, some among them had begun to see their role differently, viewing themselves not as protectors of specific places and knowledge, but as rulers destined to impose their vision of perfect order upon the chaotic world of mortal creatures. The war was terrible, she said, her voice heavy with ancient sorrow. Brother fought against brother. The children who had created us could not control what we had become. Men, desperate to survive, learned to forge weapons that could end our existence. And in the end, a compact was made. The wall, she revealed, had never been meant simply to keep the others out. It had been built as part of a carefully negotiated agreement, a containment that would hold until the proper moment arrived, until someone with the right bloodline and preparation could assume the role that was always intended for the Stark lineage. Brandon the Builder did not construct the wall to protect the realm, she continued. He built it as part of an agreement, a promise made between the warm world and the cold, between life that burns bright and brief and existence that endures forever. The implications of her words settled over the Lord Commander like a shroud of ice. Everything he had believed about his purpose, about the Night's Watch, about the wall itself, all of it had been incomplete at best, deliberately misleading at worst. "What are you offering?" he asked, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was hearing. "Partnership," she replied simply. "Alliance. The world is changing, and not for the better. Men war among themselves, burning cities and forests, destroying in years what took centuries to build. And in the far north, in places where even I dare not venture alone, ancient powers are stirring. Powers that make the others you know from legend seem like children playing at winter." She showed him visions then, not through any device or magic he could see, but directly into his mind. He saw cities of ice buried beneath miles of frozen wasteland, their spires reaching down into the earth instead of up toward the sky. He saw beings of such age and power that the White Walkers of legend appeared as pale imitations. He saw the true threat that was awakening, a force that would reshape the world whether humanity was ready or not. "I need someone who carries the blood of the first men," she explained. "Someone whose family line remembers the old compacts and the ancient oaths. The Starks alone among the great houses maintain the connection to the deeper magics, the bonds that were forged when your ancestors first learned to treat with powers beyond mortal understanding. The Lord Commander found himself imagining the possibilities, the knowledge she could share, the insight she could provide into threats that no living person understood, the power to preserve rather than merely defend, to guide change rather than simply react to it. But Sir Roderick, ever cautious, voiced the question that burned in all their minds. And what would such an alliance require of us? What price would you ask for this cooperation? She smiled then, and her smile was like sunlight on snow, beautiful and cold and somehow heartbreaking. Only trust, only the willingness to see beyond the surface of things, to understand that power and wisdom sometimes wear faces that mortal eyes find strange or frightening. I ask for companionship in the deep places where I must walk, for protection while I work to strengthen the barriers against those who would bring endless winter to all the world. It sounded reasonable, it sounded noble, but something in the way shadows fell around her, something in the perfect stillness of the air when she spoke, whispered warnings that went deeper than rational thought. The Lord Commander made his choice. Not immediately. He was not a fool, and he had not survived this long by making rash decisions. But over the days that followed, as she showed them more of the truth, more of the ancient knowledge that had been lost, he began to understand that she was offering something unprecedented, the chance to transcend the limitations of mortal flesh and time. She took them deeper into the haunted forest, to places where the boundaries between the world of men and the realm of winter grew thin. Ancient ruins emerged from the permafrost, not human construction, but something older, something that predated even the children of the forest. In these ruins, she showed them archives of knowledge that spanned geological ages, libraries carved into living ice, containing wisdom that the Meisters of the Citadel could not begin to comprehend. She showed them the truth about consciousness, that it was not dependent upon warm flesh, but could be preserved in other forms, other media. You fear death, she said simply. All your kind do. You build monuments and write songs, desperate to leave something behind when your brief candle gutters out. But what if death was not an ending? What if it was simply a transformation, a change of state that allowed different forms of existence? The Lord Commander felt it beginning in himself first, the subtle changes that marked the start of his transformation. His breath no longer steamed in the cold air. Frost patterns began to appear on his skin, delicate and beautiful, refusing to melt despite the warmth of his body. His thoughts became clearer, sharper, able to process information and make connections that had eluded him before. It did not hurt. That was perhaps the most seductive thing about it. The cold that had always been an enemy to be endured became an ally to embrace, bringing clarity of thought and perception that his warm mortal flesh had never allowed. His companions underwent similar changes, though at different rates and to different degrees. Young Thomas Umber embraced it most readily, his Stark blood, distant though it was, recognizing and accepting the transformation. Sir Roderick resisted longest, his weathered pragmatism warring with the evidence of his own senses. But in the end, they all accepted it, because she had been telling them the truth. In the far north, in places so remote that even the boldest wildlings had never ventured there, ancient powers were indeed stirring. Through the knowledge she shared, they could sense it. A vast, cold intelligence becoming aware of the world again after eons of slumber. When they finally returned to the wall, They were changed men, not monsters. They retained their essential humanity, their capacity for loyalty and duty and even love. But these emotions now operated on scales that encompassed centuries rather than the brief decades of mortal existence. The wall recognized what they had become. As they approached the tunnel, the ancient ice seemed to sing, not with alarm or rejection, but with a kind of satisfaction, as if something that had been waiting for 8,000 years was finally coming to fruition. The magic in the wall's foundation had been designed to respond to exactly this transformation. Brandon the Builder had known. The first men who had helped construct it had known. The Night's Watch had been created not simply to guard against the others, but to eventually produce individuals capable of bridging both worlds. They passed through the wall at dawn, and Castle Black lay before them wrapped in pre-dawn darkness. But even from a distance, the Lord Commander could sense the unease that had settled over the ancient fortress during their absence. His men had felt his transformation across the miles, their connection to his leadership creating resonances that disturbed their sleep and filled their dreams with visions they could not understand. Meister Qyburn was the first to meet them in the courtyard, and the words died on his lips when he looked upon his Lord Commander's transformed features. The man who had left was gone. In his place stood something more, still recognizably the commander he had served, but elevated beyond the crude limitations of ordinary mortality. "My lord," the master whispered, his scholarly mind struggling to catalogue what his eyes were showing him. "I am still your Lord Commander," the transformed figure replied, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through dimensions of sound that human ears were not designed to detect. "But I am also something more now, something that our order was always meant to produce when the proper time arrived." Word spread through Castle Black with the speed that only momentous news can achieve. Brothers emerged from every corner of the ancient fortress to witness what their leader had become. Some came with curiosity, others with fear, but all were drawn by an instinct deeper than conscious thought that told them they were witnessing a transformation that would reshape everything they understood about their purpose and their world. The great hall filled with black-cloaked figures, their faces reflecting every emotion from awe to terror, as they beheld not just their transformed commander, but his equally changed companions standing at his side. The Lord Commander, though he was beginning to think of himself as something more, something for which the old titles no longer seemed adequate, addressed his brothers with complete honesty. "I have journeyed beyond the wall and learned truths that change everything we thought we knew about our purpose here. The Night's Watch was never created simply to guard against wildling raids or even the return of legendary enemies. We were established to produce individuals capable of bridging the gap between the warm world of mortal life and the cold realm of eternal preservation." The division was immediate and total. This happens in every revolution, every transformation of a fundamental institution. The younger men, whose oaths were still fresh and whose loyalties were uncomplicated by decades of tradition, listened. They felt the power radiating from their commander. They saw the logic in what he was saying. Why die of old age? Why rot in the ground? Why let the world burn in the wars of southern kings when there was an alternative? But the older brothers, those who had served the watch for most of their adult lives, recoiled in horror. They saw a monster wearing their commander's face. They saw a breach of everything they held dear. Their understanding of duty had been shaped by generations of teaching that emphasized simple concepts: good and evil, protection and threat, human and other. The nuanced realities they now faced required forms of thinking that challenged everything they had been taught. Sir Alistair Thorne, his scarred face reflecting the kind of conflict that tore at men caught between old loyalties and new realities, stepped forward to voice the question that burned in every mind present. "And what of our oaths, my lord? What of the vows we swore to be the shield that guards the realms of men?" The Night's King, for that is what he was becoming, though the title carried meanings far deeper than the simple designation most histories would record, smiled with genuine warmth despite the cold radiance that now defined his transformed nature. "Our oaths remain binding," he said, "but their meaning has evolved beyond the simple interpretations we once held. We are still the shield that guards the realms of men, but now we protect not just against immediate threats, but against the chaos that ultimately destroys everything it touches." The chronicles tell us that the Night's King ruled for 13 years from the Nightfort. 13 years of darkness, they call it. 13 years of horror and sacrifice and deeds so terrible that mothers still frighten their children with tales of that time. But what if the chronicles are wrong? What if those 13 years were not years of darkness, but years of transformation? Years when the Night's Watch finally fulfilled its true purpose. The Night's King did not rule through fear or force. Those who joined him did so willingly, understanding at levels deeper than rational thought that he was offering them something precious: the chance to transcend the limitations of mortal flesh and time. The free folk beyond the wall were not victims, as later histories would claim. They were volunteers. Wildling clans came to the Nightfort of their own accord, drawn by the same instinct that had drawn the Night's King himself. They understood, in ways that civilized southerners never could, that winter was not the enemy. Winter was simply another face of the world, and there was power and peace in accepting it, rather than fighting against it forever. The sacrifices that later accounts speak of with such horror, they were transformations, willing participants who chose preservation over decay, who chose to become something more than the brief candles that mortal men represent. The Night's King and his corpse queen ruled from the Nightfort, yes, but they ruled over a community that was beginning to understand a fundamental truth. The boundary between life and death was not as absolute as men believed. Consciousness could be preserved. Wisdom could endure. Love could transcend the grave. During those 13 years, the Nightfort became something unprecedented in human history, a place where the living and the preserved existed together, learning from each other, building something new. But the world was not ready for this knowledge. The alliance that brought down the Night's King tells us everything we need to know about why he failed. Brandon the Breaker, the king in the north, and Joramun, the king beyond the wall, two rulers who should have been enemies, joined forces against him. Think about that. A Stark and a Wildling king working together. That alone suggests that what the Night's King represented was so threatening to the established order that it forced ancient enemies to become allies. The official histories tell us they marched on the Nightfort with a great army. They broke down the gates. They freed the Night's Watch from his sorcery. They killed the Corpse Queen and cast the Night's King down. But there are inconsistencies in these accounts, details that don't quite add up. If the Night's King was truly a tyrant, if his reign was truly based on dark sorcery that enslaved men against their will, why did so many fight to defend him? The chronicles mention a great battle, suggesting significant resistance. These were not enchanted puppets fighting because they had no choice. These were men and women who believed in what the Night's King was building. And what happened to the Night's King himself? The chronicles are frustratingly vague on this point. They say he was cast down, and his name was forbidden and forgotten. But they don't actually say he died. You cannot kill winter. You can only wait for it to pass. The erasure of the Night's King's name and records was so thorough that it suggests something beyond simple victory over a tyrant. It suggests fear. It suggests that those who defeated him understood that his ideas were dangerous, not because they were evil, but because they were seductive. The truth he offered, that death need not be the end, that consciousness and wisdom could be preserved, that humanity could evolve beyond its mortal limitations. This was too dangerous to be allowed to spread. The kings of the warm world, the lords who built their power on the cycles of birth and death and inheritance, could not allow people to believe there was an alternative. So they erased everything. They burned the records. They forbade the name. They turned the Night's King into a cautionary tale, a monster to frighten children, a warning about the dangers of ambition and forbidden love. But they couldn't erase the story entirely. It survived in Old Nan's tales, in songs sung beyond the wall, in runes carved on ancient stones. The truth has a way of persisting, even when powerful men try to bury it. So what really happened to the Night's King after his defeat? The forbidden texts, the ones the citadel burned, the ones preserved in the deepest crypts of Winterfell, suggest something that would shake the foundations of everything we believe about Westeros and its history. They suggest he withdrew. He saw that the world was not ready for the transformation he offered. The warm bloods, the kings of the south and the free folk of the north, they clung to their mortality. They loved their fire. They loved their short, burning lives. They were terrified of the cold peace he represented. So he made a choice. Rather than force his vision upon an unwilling world, rather than continue a war that would have devastated both sides, he withdrew. He took his most devoted followers, the transformed brothers, the wildling clans who had accepted the change, and his corpse queen, and he went deep into the lands of always winter. So deep that even the boldest rangers never found them. So deep that they passed from history into legend. But he didn't die. How could he? Death was what he had transcended. Time was what he had learned to escape. The Night's King sits on a throne of ice in a palace that exists in dimensions the warm world cannot perceive. He waits, he watches, and he prepares. This changes everything we think we know about the wall. We look at it and see a barrier keeping the monsters out. But what if it's not keeping them out? What if it's marking a boundary? The wall stands as the division between two worlds, the world of fire and the world of ice, the realm of change and the realm of preservation, the domain of those who burn bright and brief, and the kingdom of those who endure forever. The magic in the wall responds to both sides of this equation. It keeps them separate not to protect one from the other, but to maintain the balance, to ensure that neither fire nor ice consumes everything. Brandon the Builder understood this. That's why he wove the magic the way he did. That's why certain bloodlines, particularly the Starks, can pass through the wall's enchantments more easily than others. They carry the heritage of both worlds in their veins. And now, 8,000 years later, the cycle is beginning again. The White Walkers are returning. The cold winds are blowing from the north. The Night's King is stirring in his palace of ice. But perhaps returning is the wrong word. Perhaps they never left. Perhaps they've been there all along, watching and waiting, biding their time until the world was ready to hear the message they carry. Look at Westeros now. Look at what the warm world has become. Centuries of war. Kingdoms rising and falling. Cities burned. Forests destroyed. The land itself growing sick from the constant consumption. The endless burning. The refusal to let anything rest in peace. The Game of Thrones, that endless, pointless struggle for power, has brought the realm to the brink of destruction. The dragons have returned, those symbols of fire and consumption, and everywhere they go, they leave ash and ruin. Maybe the Night's King isn't returning to destroy the world. Maybe he's returning to save it from itself. This brings us to the deepest layer of the conflict, the war between ice and fire that George R.R. Martin has been building toward all along. The Targaryens represent everything the Night's King opposes. They are fire made flesh. They are change and transformation through destruction. Their dragons burn away the old to make room for the new, consuming everything in their path, leaving nothing but ash and memory. The Night's King represents the opposite. He is preservation. He is stasis. He is order imposed upon chaos. A flower frozen in ice is perfect forever. It never wilts, never fades, never dies. It also never grows, never changes, never becomes something new. This is the fundamental conflict at the heart of A Song of Ice and Fire. Not good versus evil, not hero versus villain, but two different visions of what the world should be. Should the world burn bright and brief, constantly changing, constantly consuming itself and being reborn from its own ashes? Or should it freeze into perfection, preserving everything beautiful and meaningful, unchanging and eternal? The Targaryens dream of spring eternal, endless growth, constant transformation, the kind of warmth that burns away everything it claims to nurture. But spring without winter leads to drought. Growth without boundaries becomes cancer. Change without preservation destroys the very things it seeks to improve. The Night's King offers the alternative. Winter eternal, perfect preservation. The peace that comes from accepting that some things should not change. That some beauty is too precious to risk losing to the chaos of endless transformation. Neither vision is entirely right. Neither is entirely wrong. And that's the tragedy at the heart of this story. So what are the others really? Are they monsters? Are they saviors? Are they weapons that escape their maker's control? The truth, as always, is more complex than any simple answer can capture. They are what the Night's King and his Corpse Queen created, or perhaps what they became. They are consciousness preserved in ice, wisdom that has endured for thousands of years, power that transcends the limitations of warm flesh. They are the ultimate expression of the choice the Night's King made on that day, 8,000 years ago, when he saw a woman with skin like snow and eyes like stars, and chose to follow her into the cold. They are what humanity could become if it was willing to pay the price of transformation. The others aren't coming to kill everyone, though many will die in what's coming. They're coming to offer the choice again, the same choice they offered 8,000 years ago, the choice the warm world rejected. Join us. Accept the change. Transcend your mortality. Preserve what you love in perfect ice, unchanging and eternal. Or burn. Keep your fire. Keep your brief, passionate lives. Keep your endless wars and struggles and transformations. But know that fire consumes everything eventually, even itself. The Night's King sits on his throne of ice, and he waits. He watches the Game of Thrones play out in the south. The Starks and Lannisters, the Baratheons and Targaryens, all fighting over a chair forged from the swords of the conquered. He sees them burn each other's cities, murder each other's children, destroy in months what took generations to build. He sees the dragons soaring over King's Landing, breathing fire that melts stone and flesh alike. He sees the mad Targaryen queen, who wants to break the wheel, as if breaking something can ever create anything but more broken pieces. He sees all of this, and he waits, because winter is patient. Winter always returns. The wheel of seasons turns, no matter how desperately men try to hold it in place. The fire always burns down eventually, leaving nothing but cold ash. And when the world has tired itself out with burning, when the last dragon falls from the sky, when the final battle is fought, and the survivors look around at the ruins they've created, then the Night's King will come. Not with an army of the dead, though death will march with him. Not with conquest and destruction, though many will call it that. He will come with an offer. The same offer he made 8,000 years ago. The offer that the warm world rejected then, but might be ready to hear now. Peace, preservation, the chance to freeze this moment of beauty before it burns away forever. The choice will be the same as it always was. Accept the cold or keep burning. When the cold winds blow from the north and you pull your furs tighter around you and you shiver in your bed, remember this. The Night's King is not the monster in the darkness. He is not the enemy at the gates. He is not the death that comes in winter. He is the guardian standing at the window, waiting patiently for you to realize that the only way to stop the pain, the only way to end the endless cycle of burning and rebuilding and burning again, is to accept what he's offering. The fire will burn itself out eventually. It always does. But ice is patient. Ice endures. Ice preserves everything you love in perfect stillness, unchanging forever. Winter is coming. It has always been coming. And for the Night's King, winter is the only thing that lasts. The wall stands at the edge of the world, that massive barrier of ancient ice. And if you listen closely on a quiet night, you can hear it singing. Not a song of warning, not a song of fear, a song of welcome, a song of homecoming, a song that says, the cage that looks like a shield is also a door, and one day, perhaps soon, that door will open. Winter is here, and it's time to choose.